Trinitarians, again, their worst issue is they over-glorify the Son in ways that I think I can still at least work with if they don't contradict me. They're going to have to answer for that, though, of course, because it's equally clear that Jesus is the beginning of God's creation, the wisdom of Proverbs 8, the one whose origins are from ancient times, Micah 5, and who lives because of the Father. John 5:26, 6:57. All the texts, John 1:18, only begotten God, Hebrews 1:3, imprint of God's being. We could go on and on and on. We literally would probably run out of ways to show the Bible describes Jesus as having an origin of life, pre-human origin of life. So that's why we just don't tolerate the nonsense of Trinitarians or Unitarians who deny his pre-human existence, because it's not an issue in the Bible. It's clear. It's everywhere and in multiple texts. So when people deny that, we know, okay, next. Don't waste your time with people who are going to tie you up in arguments about some of the most basic statements of our faith. Now let's take a look at verse 14 in a little closer detail. Beginning of God's creation. So you have some Bibles that mistranslate this origin or ruler of God's creation. Trinitarians basically collapse when they come to this text, the hardened apologetic whack jobs. Normal Trinitarian people who are just trying to worship God in Christ, they don't really care about this stuff too much. I mean, they'd care about how we translate verse 14, but I'm talking about the ones who repeatedly seek out people like you and me to argue over how these texts should be translated. So, let's take a look at a section from one of my writings that talks about Revelation 3:14. Let's just do this real briefly. So this is my third edition. You can get a copy in either hard cover or digital format. You can get this section on Revelation 3:14 for free. It's on my topical index under B, Bible texts, Revelation 3:14. Let's take a look at the section. Okay, so according to the Revised Standard Version, Jesus is called in Revelation 3:14 the beginning of God's creation. NWT, beginning of the creation by God. The Greek is he arche tes keteseos to theou, the beginning of the creation by God, or of God. God is the one creating here, not Jesus. He's never shown as the one creating. Even Colossians 1:16, 17, the verb for create is passive, showing that someone else is creating through him, the one who made him firstborn. So the question is, why do some Bibles mistranslate this and not call Jesus what he's called, that is the beginning of God's creation? Well, it's really simple. They either believe in the Trinity, which requires them to deny these biblical texts, or they believe in Unitarianism, which requires them to do the same. Okay, so Ron Rhodes, in his book, Reasoning from the Scriptures with Jehovah's Witnesses, he says, in responding to the Watchtower's interpretation of Revelation 3:14, it's critical to note there's a wide range of meanings for the Greek word translated beginning, arche. And that's true. But let's take a little bit closer look at this, because that's just not an accurate assessment in total. So while it is true arche can have meaning other than beginning, if we check all the occurrences of arche in the New Testament, when it's followed by a genitive expression of the, like in this case, of the creation, that's what is meant by a genitive, shows that it always denotes a beginning or first part of something. See, Rhodes just highlights the word and doesn't look at it critically in its grammatical context. And even when it's used without a genitive expression of the, it means beginning 32 times. In fact, several times in Revelation, what does God call himself? Beginning and end. Note the contrast with beginning and end. He's not calling himself the ruler and the end. Beginning and end. Alpha and Omega. First, last. Revelation 22, we'll get to it. Totally inconsistent with what Jesus is called here in Revelation 3:14. So it's not true that arche with a genitive means anything but beginning, and we're going to go through that in the New Testament. And even on its own, apart from a genitive expression, that is, it means beginning 32 times. Now, the 13 times, the remaining 13 times, I should say, of arche in the New Testament, 2 times. Okay, so 32 times it's used of a beginning when it's not a part of a genitive expression. The other 13 times that it's not used with a genitive, like in Revelation 3:14, 2 are used of the 4 corners of the earth. Corners, there's like a starting point. The final 11 are used to denote governments or rulers, and where such meanings are intended, this is very important. Arche in the New Testament is always used with other expressions that denote power, dunamis, or authority, exousia. Always. So Rhodes, he just says there's a wide range of meanings for the Greek word. Doesn't get into the fact that it always means beginning when part of a genitive. Means beginning 32 of the 45 times it's used apart from a genitive. And the remaining 13, 2 of them are for the extremities of the earth, the starting points or beginning points of the corners of the earth, however you would look at that. Clearly doesn't involve rulership. And the 11 times that it does denote governments or rulers, it's always used with other qualifying terms denoting power and authority, which we don't find in Revelation 3:14, in addition to it being used as part of a genitive expression. So based on the above information, the use of the singular arche in general and when used with the genitive expression specifically support beginning as the meaning of arche in Revelation 3:14. Now, in spite of these good reasons that I just reviewed, Rose cites the Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, and Danker lexicon, where it says arche can mean first cause. And it does list Revelation 3:14 under that text. Now, there was some change made in this, however, as it relates to the Bauer, Arndt, and Gingrich lexicon. But let's just go with what I have cited here. No biblical passages are cited in the Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, Danker lexicon under arche for where they cite Revelation 3:14 as being first cause. None. And they can't do that because I just went through all the uses of arche with you. It always means beginning when it's used with a genitive. And it never has the meaning first cause. Yet that's what they listed under here. Just got to watch some of these lexicons and dictionaries at times because they'll include various Trinitarian ideas or concepts with no biblical evidence. Now, the same lexicon went on to say this, which Rhodes did not mention. The meaning beginning equal first created is linguistically possible. And I would argue it's actually probable, if not required, based on the information we just reviewed. Let's go over a few examples. So I've talked about arche with a genitive, right? Always meaning beginning, like in Revelation 3:14. Here are examples. Matthew 24:8. Beginning of birth pangs. It's a start of the pangs of birth. Mark 13:19. Very similar to Revelation 3:14, identical except for the use of the article. Arches kteseos. Beginning of creation. It's exactly like Revelation 3:14 except for the article. John 2:11. Beginning of the signs. Philippians 4:15. Beginning of the good news, not ruler of the good news. Hebrews 3:14. This is a little bit different one. The confidence we had at the beginning. I have a note to this here. You can look at the particulars. But also means beginning. Hebrews 5:12. The beginning of the words of God. We can go on and on. You could look at every single text where you have, here's another one very similar to Revelation 3:14 and the one from Mark. 2 Peter 3:4. Ap arches kteseos. From the beginning of creation. Exactly. Except for the article, like Revelation 3:14. Now, there are plenty of other examples from the Septuagint or Greek Old Testament text translated into Greek, And I give examples in my note down here you can look at. We'll take a look at one though. Now the lexicon, the Bag lexicon, Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, Danker, refers to an article by C.F. Burney, an older scholar who wrote a while ago. And I cited this in my chapter in this book on Proverbs 8:22, because Burney also writes about that. But he, with reference to Revelation 3:14, he believes that's an allusion to Proverbs 8:22, and I believe he's correct, because it even refers to wisdom as in the same way as Jesus in Revelation. Here's what it says. So Burney, first, let's see what he says. Interpreters have not a shadow of authority for limiting and meaning to the source of God's creation, or first cause, like Bag. Bag refers to the article by Burney, and in stating first cause with no examples is contradicted by Burney, the very article they cite, who says there's not a shadow of authority, which is why they cited no texts for first cause. Now, if we look at Rhodes' view, he believes Revelation 3:14 means Jesus is the beginner of God's creation. The Trinitarians have such a difficult time with these clear biblical texts that they can't accept because of their teaching. They have to totally torture them into a new understanding that is contradicted by every other text that pertains to this issue. In other words, again, it doesn't even make sense what he's talking about. God's creation. God's the one who creates through the Word. God is the beginner, yet he makes Jesus the beginner of God's creation. How could that be when God's the one doing the creating? He believes this passage harmonizes with Colossians, Hebrews 1, and John 1:3, all of which teach exactly what we're talking about in Revelation 3:14. Colossians 1:15 calls Jesus the firstborn. Deuteronomy 21:17 couldn't be clearer. That means he's the beginning of God's generative power. Just like every other firstborn means they're the firstborn, beginning of that Father's generative power. Jesus is not figuratively the firstborn. He's the firstborn, only begotten Son of God. The only one called those terms, no one else. He's not using titles that belong rightly to God's true firstborn. He is God's true firstborn. Hebrews 1:2 says he's the imprint of God's being and the one through whom God made the ages. John 1:3 sets up the context with Genesis 1, in the beginning. All things that were made in the beginning were made through the Word. That's dealing with the beginning of the physical creation. Colossians 1 goes beyond that and deals with other creations, which were made by God through the firstborn, just like Proverbs teaches. The one who was there with Jah in the beginning. It says that in Proverbs 8. He was putting things together with the Father. Okay, now, of course, 1 Corinthians 8:6 states clearly that all things are out of the Father and through the Son. Consistent again with Proverbs 8. So now let's talk about one Old Testament text, though, that has come up in various discussions. In Job 40:19. Here reference is made to the beginning of the Lord's creation. Arche plasmatos kyriou. Here a form of the Greek word plasma is used instead of create, keteseos, is used, which can involve something or someone formed, such as when Adam was formed from the dust. See, it doesn't use creation. It used form, a form of the word plasma, the way Adam was formed from the dust. In Genesis 2:7-8, the LXX in the Septuagint, in fact, uses a form of plaso, which means to form. And in Genesis 2:7-8, the Hebrew text uses a word which more closely, I should say, corresponds to plaso in terms of forming something. The Hebrew text uses a word which refers to the beginning of God's ways. In Job 40:19, where the Septuagint here says beginning of the formations, the things the Lord formed, the Hebrew text says that the behemoth here, this was being described in Job, is the beginning of Jah's ways. And that's significant because in Proverbs 8:22, that's exactly how wisdom is described, but in the pre-earthly time. Whereas here, Behemoth is being referred to in the earthly realm as the beginning of the formations of Jah. And let's talk about what is meant there. As for Behemoth, the one called the beginning of the Lord's creation, no one knows exactly what type of creature that is. Some say hippopotamus, but that doesn't fit well with the other descriptions where Behemoth's tail is said to bend down like a cedar tree. Now you get a hippopotamus's tail. It is not something you would describe like a cedar tree. And then consider the account in Genesis 1 and 2. On the 5th day of creation, we'll talk more about this in our coming day text. Genesis 1:24 says, "Let the earth put forth living souls according to their kinds." Domestic animal, Hebrew, behemah. That's the singular form of behemoth, used in Job 40:19. And moving animal and wild beast in earth according to its kind. I believe what Job 40 is talking about is what Genesis 1:24 is here describing, even referring to the very same type of creature. So, it would then appear that Behemoth was the beginning of the Lord's creation of the land formations, right? Not creation in the total absolute sense, but the formation of animals from the dust of the earth, just like the Bible describes Jah doing on the 5th day. So all of these things are consistent with the use of the term arche in Revelation 3:14. One other text we could look at is in Numbers 24:20. Here it uses arche for Amalek as the first of the nations, or the beginning of the nations. But Amalek was not the first of the nations, right? Chronologically speaking. However, Amalek was the first nation to fight against Israel after they left Egypt. And the Targums, the Jewish interpretations of these events, the Targums of Onkelos, Neophiti, and Pseudo-Jonathan, really the Jerusalem Targum, make this meaning explicit in their translations. The Targums translate the text from Numbers 24:20, the first of the nations who waged war. So I know of no example in biblical or in literature contemporary with the Bible where arche means origin or first cause. Yet that is the meaning preferred by Rhodes. It seems to be preferred in one edition of the Bauer-Gingrich-Danker lexicon, and which Trinitarians highlight in the face and in contradiction to all the evidence that I just presented. And that wasn't even all of it. That wasn't even all the evidence that could be presented. Arche with a genitive never means anything but beginning or start. Arche on its own means beginning 32 of the 45 times in the New Testament that it's used. Only 11 times is it used to denote governments or rulership, and that's always in connection with other terms that convey the same meaning. None of which are used as part of arche, those texts, of a genitive expression like Revelation 3:14. We have almost exact parallels from 2 Peter 2:4, ap arches kteseos, and Mark 13:19, arches kteseos. That's almost identical to he arche tes kteseos. Just the article. That's it. And that's because he's the beginning. Not just the beginning of this or that. He's the beginning of the creation by God.